Hello and welcome to today's event, Cybersecurity and Healthcare, a panel discussion with industry thought leaders. I'm Carol Flagg of HITech Answers. Thanks for joining us today. Today's event is sponsored by Spock, a leader in critical communications for healthcare, government, public safety, and other industries. Organizations worldwide rely on Spock for workflow improvement, secure texting, paging services, contact center optimization, and public safety response. Visit them online at www.spock.com. Before we begin, we've got a few housekeeping issues. First, this is a webcam event and is being recorded. Post-event, you'll be emailed a link to the YouTube video of the event. Look for an email from events@hitechanswers.com. We will also allow for some questions post-discussion. Please use the question box found on the right side of the GoToWebinar dashboard to pose your question. And if we don't get to your question today, please email me directly at carol@hitechanswers.com and I'll forward your questions on to the appropriate expert. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator and panelists for today's event. Our moderator on webcam is healthcare attorney Matt Fisher. Matt is an associate with Merrick O'Connell. He's chair of the firm's health law group and a member of the firm's business group. Matt focuses his practice on health law and all areas of corporate transaction. Matt's health law practice includes advising clients with regulatory, fraud, abuse, and compliance issues. His regulatory advice focuses on complying with requirements of HIPAA and the Stark Law, Anti-Kickback Statute, fraud and abuse regulations. He's also chair of the American Bar Association's Health Law Section's Web and Technology Committee. Our panelists on webcam today are Lee Barrett, Executive Director of ENAC, a federally recognized standards development organization designed to improve transactional quality, operational efficiency, and data security in healthcare. Lee speaks nationally on a variety of e-health and e-commerce and industry topics and is involved in a number of industry coalitions promoting the use and implementation of both administrative and clinical transactions, including the development and proliferation of electronic health records and meaningful use. He also works on key e-health industry initiatives that lay the foundation for health information technology, including ARA, HIPAA, and HITECH. Mark Eggleston is a VP and Chief Information Security Officer and Privacy Officer for Health Partners Plan. Mark's background includes the development of an internal compliance approach, complete with policies and tools to ensure a geographically dispersed healthcare provider organization were HIPAA compliant. Serving as a consultant program manager and project manager across the provider organization, he also researched, wrote, and communicated corporate policies, procedures, and guidelines and forms to meet federally mandated privacy and security requirements. More recently, he's applied his HIPAA expertise to a local health plan by developing a privacy and security compliance program, maintaining compliance with HIPAA's privacy, security, and standardized transaction regulations. MacMillan is co-founder and CEO of Synergist Tech, Inc., an authority in information security, privacy, audit, and regulatory compliance in healthcare. He's the current chair of the HIMSS Privacy and Security Policy Task Force. Mac brings nearly 40 years of combined intelligence, security countermeasures, and consulting experience from positions with both government and private sector positions, and has worked in healthcare industry since his retirement from the federal government in 2000. He served as Director of Security for 2 separate defense agencies and sat on numerous interagency intelligence and security countermeasure committees while serving in the U.S. government. He currently sits on several advisory boards, including Chime, Heat Exchange, and Healthcare's Most Wired Secure Survey Advisory Board. And finally, joining us by phone is Ileana Peter, the Senior Advisor for HIPAA Compliance and Enforcement at the HHS Office for Civil Rights. In this role, she is the national lead for OCR enforcement of the HIPAA rules and works closely with OCR's 10 regional offices to promote compliance with enforcement of the HIPAA rules. Additionally, she supports many other OCR policy and outreach initiatives, including rulemaking, compliance initiatives with other federal agencies and training, including the state attorneys generals. She received her law degree from Duke and her master's of law in healthcare law from the University of Houston's Health Law and Policy Institute. Thank you all for joining us today. Matt, I'm going to go on mute and turn this broadcast over to you, and I will see you back on the Q&A.
Well, Carol, thank you for that great introduction for everybody. What we're going to do today, as Carol said, is have a nice roundtable discussion about a variety of topics. And what we're going to do is just jump right into it. The first topic that I think we're going to address is risk analysis. I think a lot of people have seen that's been a major shortcoming in connection with meaningful use. So what I'd like to pose to the panel first is, why do people think that organizations are falling short on the risk analysis component?
How would you like to
off with
order?
that? I'll chime in and simply say, I mean, I think let's start elemental. I think, first of all, you just need to do it and understand that it's a technical and a non-technical evaluation. Starting with the rule is a great place, checking off all the administrative and the physical and technical security standards, and then moving on and hopefully at some point getting a third-party assessment of your approach and intermediary to see how your risk analysis, your methodology works. But typically just start doing something and do it at a reoccurring basis is a great place to start.
Yeah, I'd say from the folks that we work with in the field and the instances that we get involved with in terms of folks who have run afoul of the risk assessment requirement, it really comes down to basically one of three issues. The first one is not doing it or not doing it on a frequent enough basis, and the second one is not doing it correctly, meaning following an analytical process, a prescribed process for what a risk assessment is, as opposed to just doing an audit checklist, which unfortunately some people think equates to a risk assessment. And the last one is not being thorough enough, not actually addressing the entire environment, all of the assets that have protected health information on them within the environment, and not being able to demonstrate that they've actually covered the full gamut of where that patient information could be at risk in their environment. So Mark's absolutely correct. Number one, first thing is get out of your way and get started. And the second thing is, when you do, make sure that you think through how you're going to do it, how often you're going to do it, and be able to demonstrate that that's exactly what you're doing.
I think the other thing, just in adding to what Mark and Mac were talking about, it is not just doing it is absolutely critical, but what we see as we're auditing a lot of these organizations is the fact that many of them don't have regular process in which they're going through to look at where their vulnerabilities are, to be looking at doing their penetration testing on an ongoing basis, looking at the alerts, how they need to react to some of these alerts that in fact come up with the intrusion detection that they may have in place, how they need to responding to these is one of the things that we're finding that a lot of organizations, although they may do the risk assessment, and I'm totally in agreement that needs to be done regularly, and I think as well having kind of that third-party review to look at and identify where there may be any additional gaps, as well as any remediation activities that organizations need to take is critical, as well as going through some type of regular process of going through and determining where their ongoing gaps may be, and then coming up with and refining their processes and their procedures to do that.
And I think Lee hit on a very important point, and that is the follow-through. And that's absolutely true, and I'm sure that Ileana can speak to their experience in terms of what they look at when they look at folks during investigations and audits there. It's not just enough to actually do that risk assessment, but when you identify those risks, then you need to do something about it and actually demonstrate what you've done. So Lee's absolutely correct. That follow-through is critical.
And Ileana, what are your thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, thanks for that lead-in, Mac. I agree with everything that Lee, Mark, and Mac have already said, and I did just want to, sort of talk a little bit more about what we expect as a regulator in terms of a risk assessment or risk analysis for HIPAA security rule purposes, just building on what everybody else has said. What we've seen in our experience is that that entities don't do a good job of understanding the data flows within their organizations. So the risk analysis many times looks like a gap analysis, or it is only for purposes of meaningful use and only addresses the EHR system. And obviously all of the healthcare providers and business associates, health insurance companies that we work with have much more data, and they don't understand where the data is created and where it flows at the end of its life cycle. And so we're seeing a real sort of falling down when it comes to understanding where all of the EPHI in the enterprise is. That's the largest issue that we continue to see. And as we all know, that the HIPAA security rule does require addressing risk to the data, to the EPHI. So, sort of changing the frame of focus from just systems or certain devices or certain technologies to really trying to understand where all of the EPHI in the enterprise is really, in our minds, the first step and the cornerstone of any good compliance program.
And I think that comprehensive point is a very good one to make. And also, I'm just going to add one additional housekeeping item that I think Carol might have maybe not forgotten, but I think we might have gone past, which is, and Ileana, this probably applies to you, knowing whenever I see a government speaker on a panel that I'm assuming you're obviously speaking on your own behalf and not on behalf of OCR.
Correct. Thank you, Matt, for that. Yes, I'm all the opinions I express now are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Department of Health and Human Services.
So with that out of the way, I wanted to kind of pick up on a point that all of you are making, which is, everyone keeps saying you, which I'm assuming is referring to the entity performing the risk analysis. Based on all the descriptions that all of you just gave, it's a very comprehensive and detailed process. So is it something that can be handled internally by an organization, or do you have to use an outside vendor, or some combination of the two? And I guess maybe I'll direct it to Ileana first, just to kind of see what their experience is, and then I'll turn it over to Lee, Mark, and Mac.
Thanks, Matt. I think from our perspective, again, we have no sort of skin in the game on who does it. We just want to make sure that it gets done correctly. And there are many tools out there that can be used to do it, whether you hire someone or whether you do it yourself. The OCR itself has two tools that we link to from our website, one that is quite a bit more sophisticated for purposes of very sophisticated organizations, and that one we partnered with NIST to develop. The other is a small provider tool that we partnered with the Office of the National Coordinator to develop, and it has videos that are associated with it to help providers who want to do their own risk analyses to really try and do a good job of those. But we understand that there are limited resources involved in much of the healthcare sector, and we want to make sure that everybody has the right tools to either do it themselves if they can't afford to hire an outside vendor, or to really know what to look for when their vendors are doing those risk analyses for them.
Lee, you want to start off?
So, what I would say that, Ileana, made a very good point. There are some excellent tools. As far as organizations doing it themselves, we're a supporter of organizations doing it themselves, and I think in many cases they need to do that. There are some great tools out there, not only what OCR and ONC have developed, but there are a variety of different toolkits that we've seen that are very good for doing risk analysis. If you look at kind of the pros and cons, Matt, when you look at this of going to an outside versus doing it inside, I think organizations, as we were talking about before, the first question is it's important that organizations go through, do the risk assessment, do have the appropriate controls in place to regularly be testing a lot of this, and I think that's all important for organizations to do. Having a third-party review, kind of, you look at the pros, having an organization that's a third-party objective, that has the credibility, they have the experience, they're non-biased, they're not looking, they don't have any political affiliation or issues that they're dealing with, so they can be very objective when they're looking at an organization. Two is many of them have the credibility and the right resources and experience to go in to look at organizations in relation to the risk assessment, the intrusion detection, all the penetration testing, all the various aspects that need to go on. I think they can assure that organizations are performing really the due diligence, and they can be going through all that due diligence. And a lot of the organizations that we're talking to as well, the whole issue on hacking and the breaches, the incidents, have reached the board level as well as audit committees. So having a third-party review also provides kind of an additional level of credibility to those organizations. Lastly, what we're finding is a lot of the cybersecurity insurers are actually, I think, over this next year, and many are starting to do this now, is requiring a third-party review before they're even going to issue or underwrite cybersecurity insurance. When you look at the cons look at the cost. But and the other thing is we tell organizations is do your due diligence on the organizations that you look at. That if you are going to use a third party to come in, do your due diligence, look at those organizations that are out there, make sure you got the right selection criteria so you can do it appropriately.
Yeah, all good points. Would agree with them all. I mean, really, whether you choose an inside or an outside resource is a it depends kind of question. I like to do things myself, so I do kind of tend to lend myself towards that method. But if folks are wanting to do that, I'd strongly suggest the NIST 800 series, specifically 853. It's a great guide which can really spell out how to do at least an elemental risk analysis. And again, many of the tools out there are very helpful. But I certainly agree with Lee's points as well. Having a third party come in and give that objective, feedback is something very important. They can also rate you in what's called a culpability maturity model, so they can tell you the advantages and disadvantages. Not everybody would want to be a 5 on a 1 to 5 rating because it could break your internet or could cause you to become so risk intolerant that you break the business, and that's certainly something that you wouldn't want to do. I think the other thing, at least at our organization and other places where I've been, your executives, they want to know, well, how do we rate against our peers? And when you get a third party, they can do just that. They can not only provide you an industry baseline, but they can tell you perhaps in your vertical or in your industry where you might fall with other people. And that's usually a good thing for executives to see. So there's no shortage of free resources, but I would certainly recommend having an internal invested interest in that report and knowing how to do it so you can have some repeatability to that process. But certainly a third party alternating to come in and do it is a great idea.
So I think I'm kind of sort of in the middle ground, and having been a former director of security at a large organization where I had responsibility for these things, I quickly realized that first of all, risk assessment is something that needs to be done on a continuous basis. It's also something that can be done at the enterprise level, it can be done at a facility level, it can be done at a program level, it can be done at an application level. And there are times when any of those particular approaches or looks are appropriate. What I always did was I always strove to make sure that I wasn't what I used to call the self-licking ice cream cone. In other words, I didn't look in the mirror and say, "You doing a great job today, Mac?" "Yep, I sure am." I wanted to make sure that I had somebody who was objective, who had the certifications and the experience and the experiential baseline, if you will, of working with a lot of other organizations like mine or even more sophisticated, that could come in and take a look at what we had done and make sure that we hadn't missed anything. So there's argument all the way around for when it's appropriate to use an external party and when it's something that can be handled internally or that in that manner. But I think it's really more a combination, and the larger the organization, the more sophisticated the organization, I think what you're going to find is you're going to have a hybrid approach to that. There's going to be certain things that you're going to recognize from a basic risk level that you're going to say, at this threshold, we're going to do it ourselves. At this threshold, I'm going to have somebody else do it because I want to have that as part of my due diligence in terms of representing my program to anybody that I have to represent it to. And I think you have to look at the expertise and the experience level of your people and determine whether or not they have what's necessary to do the job correctly, and make a smart business decision as to which way you go. Regardless, I agree with everybody that you want to use a consistent approach. You want to use a recognizable standard in terms of what you measured yourself against. So that you can absolutely point to it and say this is how we measured our program. and you want to make sure that you do that risk assessment properly, or whoever does it for you does it properly and has the experience to know how to do that. So it's not an either or for me. It's a what's appropriate depending on the size of the organization or the sophistication of the organization or whatever it is I'm looking at today. So if it's just a change in the environment, I'm probably going to do that internally. If it's my annual enterprise level risk assessment, I'm probably going to have somebody outside that's going to look across all of my organization and give me the benefit, as Mark said, of what they saw at the other 100 or 200 or 300 hospitals that they've been working with, so that I get the benefit of that experience as well.
And I think that's a great point. And it kind of, where it sounds like all of you are kind of driving is it'll depend on the circumstances which approach you want to take. Kind of just throwing in one thought maybe from a legal side would be, if you have concerns that you have an exposure or that you might be missing something, oftentimes from the legal side, if I'm advising clients, you say, okay, you want to bring in an outside consultant, but have the attorney retain that consultant, because then arguably that the results of that work could be attorney work product or subject to privilege, so that way, if you're finding a major issue, you don't necessarily have to have it out in the open for everybody to be able to see. But I kind of want to pick up on a point that I think Lee made, which was kind of a nice way to head into the second topic that I wanted to have everyone weigh in on, which is the extremely growing prevalence of hacking within the healthcare industry. Kind of as a transition from the risk analysis, I guess, what does everyone see as the most overlooked vulnerability when it comes to hacking? And since Lee was the lucky one to have mentioned hacking in his comments, I'll let him go first.
Thanks, Matt. I think the big issue that, as far as an overlooked vulnerability is the fact that, and a couple of things. First of all, what's happening in the industry is that when people start to look at this, they make the determination, well, we hear all the time, gee, it's not going to happen to me. And I think first, these organizations, as far as a vulnerability, need to look at the fact and it goes back to what organizations are doing on an ongoing basis to minimize and mitigate the risk of a breach, incident, or a cyber attack. And so one of the things that we're seeing, we see a lot of organizations that have a lot of the controls in place, but it's a matter of assuring that they're going through and utilizing, and they've got the processes and the procedures to actually execute against those controls when they're being done. We go into organizations, for example, we'll audit an organization and they'll have alerts, for example, that are coming up regarding intrusions. And many organizations are having on an ongoing basis hundreds, if not thousands, of attempts of intrusions into their organization on a daily basis. It's a matter of having the appropriate processes and that individuals are actually monitoring those alerts when they're happening, so that the appropriate either rules are already built into the system, or that they're able to take the appropriate action to mitigate that intrusion or that attempt. Those are the types of things when you start to look at vulnerabilities that are very big here, that organizations just need to look at really the follow-through, the controls, and they have to be testing on an ongoing basis their vulnerabilities so they can continue to refine their policies, their procedures, and their controls, make those changes so that it can be a far better process going forward. That's the one thing that we don't see all the time, is organizations going through and testing their entire processes and how they're going to react to different situations. That's critical.
Oh, Mark, I think we might have dropped your audio.
Thank you all. I think one of the biggest things when you talk about hacking, you must talk about is the phishing threat, right, or social engineering, especially in my industry, healthcare. We want to be helpful. We open the doors for people, sometimes without a photo badge. So you want to make sure that you're not being that much helpful to outsiders who want to do harm. And phishing is the big one that's getting lots of press. For those of you who read the Wall Street Journal this week, they had a rather bleak article about phishing and about how as long as there's humans, we're pretty much up a creek. I'm not sure if I agree with that. Something that we've done here and a lot of my colleagues have done is continual education. There are tools that you can get that will do phishing. Some of the vendors will even offer a free phishing exercise to at least open the door. And where a lot of people are doing now is continual phishing. So you can launch your own phishing attacks. That is sending out emails that try to exploit the end user's trust and get them to click on a link, give up some information, which can be reverse engineered to cause your company more harm. Download malicious software. If you look at some of the greatest breaches that have happened over the last year or two, that's in fact how these things are being caused. So launching a program that routinely tries to trick a population of your users is a difficult thing. I'm not a big fan of doing it myself. I like to have an open door policy with all of our users here, and I don't think they're going to trust me too much if I'm the guy that phishes them. But I have no qualms about hiring a third party to phish my users, and that's in fact what we've done. And then on top of that, if they do take the bait, so to speak, launching an immediate education campaign to make sure they know how to fix it next time. And we've leveraged our our LMS or learning management system to launch that education and then keep track. It is confidential, but at least we know when someone does take the bait, we can give them that remedial education. It's definitely a very helpful thing to get involved with.
So I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, when you look at the evolution of hacking over the last couple of decades, I mean, once upon a time they were attacking systems, and then they were attacking networks, then they started attacking applications, and then of course the Internet of Things, which is where we are today. But more importantly, we have evolved to where hacking is really about hacking people. And we think of hacking, oftentimes we just think systems, or we think data, or we think networks, and we really need to start thinking people, because what they're really doing for the most part of the smart hackers is they're looking for mistakes that people make, whether it's network engineers who fail to configure things properly, or close ports, or apply patches, or do any of the blocking and tackling that's required to have a good, strong integrity around your network environment, or allowing things to be connected to your network that aren't trusted. Any one of the number of things that can degrade the integrity of the environment and give the attacker an opportunity to take advantage of something. They're not necessarily breaking systems anymore. They're not reverse engineering your application and doing those kinds of attacks. They're literally taking advantage of us not being good having due diligence around our stewardship of our environment. But then secondly, as Mark brings up, they are absolutely attacking our users. Their phishing is epidemic, and anybody that thinks it isn't paying attention. In healthcare today, we don't just have the average phishing attack. We actually have very sophisticated spear phishing attacks that go after specific individuals for a specific purpose. Very sophisticated attacks that are carried on not just external to our environment, but internal to our environment, where a hacker gets access to the network, does his reconnaissance, identifies our systems and how we communicate, and uses our own material against us, and then runs a spear phishing attack against somebody internal to the organization that is much more likely to be successful than the average phishing attack that's looking for a random fish floating, swimming by. So we need to spend more time educating our users. We need to spend, and that education needs to be much more practical in its approach. The organizations that do phishing exercises on a regular basis that allow the user to experience that event in a safe environment and go directly to education, so that they begin to recognize the things that they need to look for, are going to be much more effective at avoiding those things. There's no doubt about it. You can't just teach it in a classroom. You can't just teach it through a CBT. It's something that they will learn much better if they actually experience it and have the education follow up right afterwards. But the same is true for any other of the forms of social engineering that are out there. We need to understand that it's not, hackers in the sense of what they're going after is not just systems, but when they do go after systems, 90% of the time they're going after a weakness that's in that system, because somebody didn't do something that they were supposed to from a network maintenance or administration perspective.
Picking up on points that both you, Mac and Mark made, you discussed education a lot. So kind of what do you see as effective strategies for kind of bringing the lesson home to individuals within an organization with the understanding that human error is going to occur, but what can we do to hopefully minimize the risk or the likelihood of that occurring?
So what I found, at least in my experience when I was managing these things, was that routine or regularly scheduled training like NEO training or new employee orientation or annual refresher training really wasn't that effective. One class that somebody has out of 365 days, when their focus is somewhere else, just doesn't stick. If you really want people to get it, you've got to provide it to them on an ongoing basis, and it's got to be in small snippets that they can internalize very quickly, and related to their job. Anytime, what I found when I was delivering it was that when I could make the security training relevant to what they did day in and day out, so that it was more meaningful to them, and present it in a more random basis periodically across the year, their level of awareness was much higher than if I tried to rely on some tool that was going to give them an annual training class.
Just to follow up with what Mac's saying as well, in our experience, this is one thing that I went outside for. We could have developed our own, and to answer your question, Matt, and the things you want to do is making sure that they have an immersive experience, actual real things that people have fallen for. So when I've done my stand-up presentations, I'll have examples of things that our employees may have actually taken as to bring the point home. When I went outside to get the vendor, to Mac's point as well, it was no more than 15 minutes, but you go in and you actually see some of the things and your better understanding of how these bad guys are trying to trick you. And again, to Matt's point, they're getting far more sophisticated. Several years ago, you didn't have to be the grammar police to just see that they were horrific in their phishing attack. These days, the grammar's getting a lot tighter, and it's getting a lot more immersive. And sometimes it falls back to what you're putting out there in social media. So if they're using a spear phishing attack, they're going to use something. They're going to know something about you, where you live, what you do, and they're going to bake that into their phishing attack. And that's what makes people take the bait even to a higher percentage. I mean, with 2/3 of America being subject to some form of identity theft, it's no surprise why the bad guys are continuing to take this phishing route. And the things we got to do is just continually put our user base in the hot seat for a little bit. But you don't have to spend money for some of this either. There are plenty of phishing exams out there that allow you to try and spot what's wrong with this web page, what's wrong with this email, and then you can go back and score yourself. And note to the wise, it's very hard to get 100% in any of these quizzes.
Hi, this is Ileana. I just wanted to jump in too as well. We've seen a lot of different types of cyber attacks in different circumstances as a regulator, and I do sit on the Department Cybersecurity Task Force, and I hear a lot from my colleagues, not only with regard to federal systems, but also obviously with regard to our regulated community. I do think, I absolutely agree with everything that Mark and Mac have already said, and I do just sort of want to highlight in terms of the evolutionary threats that we're talking about. We're still seeing issues with vulnerabilities created from lack of patching. So at one end of the spectrum, we're still seeing entities that do not appropriately patch their software. We have a settlement agreement on our website that discusses that fact. And, so starting there and then moving to what Lee mentioned about, if you are going to be, doing diagnostics on your systems, you need to do something about the identified vulnerabilities or the identified threats. I've talked to several vendors of many of these diagnostic services, and they're now writing into their contracts that the entities have to take action on the information that they're providing, or they're going to discontinue their service, because despite the fact that they're providing information about vulnerabilities in systems or possible threats to systems to their clients aren't taking action on that information, which is a really dangerous thing, I think, and I think everybody would recognize that. So from just patching software to taking action on identified vulnerabilities in your system to, as everyone's been talking about here, really training your staff to understand what attacks look like, because again, are seeing on this spectrum, as well as just unpacked software-specific threats to individual users, and then from there, obviously, escalation of privileges and moving through your system. So it's very likely, that our regulated community is dealing with all of these types of threats and vulnerabilities, and as was already talked about, training is so very important, and it's so important that it's in fact required by both the privacy rule and the security rule. So we do expect that entities do training on issues that are at the forefront of their compliance programs, and as you'll see from our settlement agreements as well, many of the things that we require entities to do when they settle with us have to do with appropriately training staff, because that doesn't always happen in a timely manner.
So, and Lee, do you want to weigh in at all?
I think that what Mark and Mac and Ileana have talked about are, what we're, the whole phishing aspect, as we've talked about, it's a very significant threat. And I guess it goes back to, and as the training aspect, one of the things I would just add to what they were talking about in the training, they both talked about some very good and I think very important things, which is talking about and bringing in real-life examples for people. If they can't relate to the job that somebody is doing, they have a hard time understanding what kind of impact it's going to be. It doesn't relate to them. So you have to have examples that do relate to people, do it on an ongoing basis, and I agree with everybody, you've got to do it on an ongoing basis in snippets. The other thing that we say as well from an EMAC perspective, we're also promoting for organizations to have visuals, other types of things that come up on their screen, on a screen of people, based upon what their job is, highlighting things like PHI and other signs, visuals that they have around the office. Again, it's subtle stuff, but it's very important for people to keep it front and center as far as how they're looking to deal with this, and whether they actually open an email from a phishing expedition that's gone on or not. Those are the types of things that you want to at least get people to be far more aware of and realize not to open up any email from somebody that they don't know where it came from. So I agree with Mark as well. Having third-party entities doing that is very important, and then learning from those and taking whatever additional educational or remedial actions that need to be taken as far as how people and how your organization is dealing with that is very important.
Yeah, no, I think those are all great points. And from the personal perspective, I've had similar training like that from the IT staff in my firm. It's, every industry is subject to it, not just healthcare. So, we get examples of, this is an example of a phishing email. They distribute it, and then, to hammer it home, they'll take us into a training, and on an isolated computer that's not part of the network, open it up and show us what happens. And I think that makes, as all of you are saying, that makes such a big impact in terms of understanding the consequences and why you need to be vigilant about the issues. I kind of want to take a kind of a significant turn on topics and kind of go to new legislative and regulatory developments. As I'm sure everyone was tracking, the Cybersecurity Act was included in omnibus appropriations bills in December, and wanted to talk about that and get people's views on it and question, is this law really a game changer or kind of continuing along in the same vein? I'll let Mac kind of lead off on that one.
Okay. Elizabeth, I'll caveat my answer by saying it could be a game changer. It depends on what the government does with it now that they have it. So it's a long time coming, and it's far overdue. Other industries have had the benefit of threat information that they have access, their CISOs have access to, that help them to be more aware of what's going on in their environment and what's attacking their industry. Our CISOs deserve that just as much as anybody else, and I'm glad that we've finally got some legislation out there that's hopefully gonna give us the foundation for building that. But as you know, the act itself was just the beginning. HHS now has to figure out how they're going to do it, and how we're going to put together this threat library, if you will, or this threat database that folks are going to have access to, and how they're going to gain access to that. So my guess is that we've still got a considerable amount of work to go through. They still have, I think they had a year from the time that the bill was signed to actually present how they're going to do that and how that's going to be accomplished. My guess is that there will probably be something that comes out before too long that requests support from or ideas or contributions from those folks who are involved in that kind of process. At least I hope so. We have quite a few very credible threat organizations already in the industry. I mean, you have the U.S. CERT at Carnegie Mellon. You have organizations out there that do monitoring on a regular basis for industry and collect and disseminate threat information already. So there's already people out there who know how to do this and know what they're doing. We also have other parts of the government with respect to DHS and the Bureau who have programs in place to disseminate information, threat information as well, and they already do that. So it'll be interesting to see how HHS actually harnesses all of the resources that are currently available in the industry to put together a platform that our healthcare organizations can tap into to get realistic, current threat information that can help inform their programs and their decisions. But yeah, I think it can be a game changer, but the proof will always be in the implementation, just like it always is.
From my perspective, I'm perhaps a little bit more skeptical. Like Mac, I believe that this is the future. This will be a game changer in probably 2 or 3 years. Part of the CISO's role, and I'll liken this to risk analysis. So when you do a risk analysis, one of the fundamental things is you have to know where to allocate, finite resources on things that matter. And the same thing is true when you're implementing technology. You need to choose the technology and the vendors that are really going to make the biggest bang for your buck when it comes to risk reduction. And in my mind, sharing threat intelligence is in its infancy right now, maybe a little bit more than infancy. And there's some great vendors out there. InfraGard, the private public assurance arm of the FBI, has great information you can get at your fingertips. HITRUST has a CTX, Common Threat Exchange, which allows you to, again, share this information for free. There are a gazillion vendors. When I've gone to the trade shows over the last year especially, easily half the floor is consumed with vendors doing threat intelligence. So I think it's going to be one of those things that's going to get more and more efficient, but we have to, as this law is aiming to try and do, take away the stigma with organizations sharing information about their threats and fear of, being harmed either by other folks out there that may get this information or any kind of liability concerns. So I think if we were to get past that and have an efficient method to do this, I simply just don't, and I'm lucky enough to have a great staff here with me, but I can't send 2 or 3 of those guys crunching through a lot of this just huge volumes of threat intelligence without it meaning something in my environment. So baking those threat feeds into your SIM or your security information system so it makes more relevance in your environment is a very good thing. I don't see a lot of the technology is getting right there, but I'll also include another caveat that I don't have a huge staff where I can afford to spend 3 or 4 of my staff doing just that. So I'm eagerly awaiting for it to mature.
I think I would agree with both, Mac and Mark, that I do see it as a game changer, but I think it's going to take some time. And I think a couple of things that are going to be important. First of all, I know they're in the process of establishing a task force, a cybersecurity task force. I hope that task force is going to be broadly representative of the industry. And I do think that one of the other points, Mac, that you brought up is the fact that there's a lot that's already been done. There's a lot of databases, there's a lot of information, a lot of organizations that have already are focusing on not only threats, but other aspects of whether it's accreditation, certification, that can be and should be leveraged as part of how this is going to evolve. There's a lot of great best practices, a lot of tools and tactics that should be leveraged as part of this task force. So the issue is, what I'm hoping is that HHS and the industry do out of this is really leverage and identify what's working well already and how we can look to leverage what's already out there, some of these databases and the organizations that have already been talked about. Because I think that that's going to be very important as we look to leverage what we've already got and then determine where we've got some gaps, where we've got issues, where we need to do develop some further tactics and policies, perhaps even procedures, on providing the guidance to the CISOs and the various organizations out there. So that's just my only concern, is that they look to leverage and leverage what's already been built, because there's a lot of good that has, and there's sometimes a tendency not to try to rebuild or build something new that really doesn't need to be built.
Lee, you bring up a very good point, and one of the organizations that we have that just hasn't gotten the attention, quite frankly, that I think it needs, but that now has some new leadership from another industry, is the National Health ISAC. So the National Health ISAC was absolutely created to do just these kinds of things, and Diane Anderson, who is now the head of the National Health ISAC, came over from the Finance ISAC, where they actually have a very good program of providing support to their membership. And we don't have a lot of healthcare systems who have membership in the National Health ISAC. I think we need to get more providers involved with that organization to give it more guidance and to give it more direction. But there's a perfect example of an organization that has a central focus on this problem, and who could absolutely be the focal point for pulling all of these disparate resources together and focusing them on this industry and helping this industry solve these problems. And I think that's something that all of our healthcare providers out there in America need to do. They need to call up Diane Anderson at the National Health ISAC and say, what are you doing? Let's get this going. Let's we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to create new things. We certainly don't need to find things that are going to cost us more money when we can take advantage of things that are already there. And how can we help you do that? And I think the National Health ISAC is in a perfect position to be that focal point for doing this, and if her leadership can get it there.
Kind of
Hi,
taking
this is Ileana. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to weigh in quickly. I appreciate everybody's comments and agree that, much of what we are tasked with, and by we I mean the Department of Health and Human Services in conjunction with our partners at Homeland and DOJ and others, are tasked with, we're already doing. So much of this, yes, this new task force, we are working on it. And as I said, the department's very aware of, all of the threats that to the industry, and we've been working on it for some time. We're working on the task force. As I said, we're also working on the guidance that is prescribed by CISA, as well as coordinating with our other partners. Something that has come up in these discussions, though, that I didn't hear mentioned is really the diversity of this industry. And I think it is really important to recognize that, in opposition to industries like the financial sector, the healthcare sector is incredibly diverse. And so when we're dealing with threat sharing, we have to have a better understanding of not only how to share threats with sophisticated organizations, but we also have to consider the one-doc shops and the small providers in this conversation, because many of these smaller systems and smaller providers and smaller health plans are really vulnerable, and we're seeing that as a continuing issue. So the department is trying to address that specifically with many different activities, including guidance, but also including grants that have recently been led from ASPR and ONC to try and develop ISOs that are really geared to share information with these types of entities that are free. Because as was previously mentioned, there are some really good resources and really good ISOs or ISAs that may be available for a cost, but many of our industry participants really don't have any extra money to participate in that type of threat sharing organization. So, so the department is very conscious of that and is really working to not only share threats out of the department, threat information out of the department in coordination with our partners at the MTIC, our partners at DOJ, our partners at Homeland, but also to really address a real identified need from the smaller members of this very diverse sector.
I think that's a very good point, that healthcare is a very diverse sector, and that when you're dealing with these issues, you're trying to figure out a way that it can apply, and you're not going to overburden some organizations depending on their circumstances. So, kind of with that in mind, does the security rule under HIPAA, does it meet current needs, or are changes needed? And if there are changes needed, what would people like to see? I guess I'd ask Ileana to go first on that one, just from the perspective, of you seeing it with regard to enforcement, and then we'll go through Lee, Mark, and Mac.
Thanks, Matt. I think the department's always welcome to suggestions, and we have, received guidance from the secretary that we should, throughout the department, we should be looking at our different regulatory authorities to determine how we can, in fact, improve them and or modernize them as necessary. So I'm really excited to hear suggestions from, the panel. I do just want to emphasize that one of the things that I think is pretty fantastic about the HIPAA security rule, and granted I may be a little biased, but I do think that, the rule was built to be flexible and scalable and technology neutral. And that was done on purpose so that it could sort of mature as our industry matured. So we don't include things like NIST-specific guidance within our regulations, because guidance can be changed quickly and regulations cannot be changed quickly. So, so we're really invested in the security rule being able to, being malleable enough to adapt to the industry over time. Encryption is a great example of that. Encryption, as we all know, is an addressable specification. However, that doesn't make it optional. And encryption is the baseline unless there are reasonable compensating controls and a reason to use those reasonable compensating controls. So, for example, encryption, I don't know what the next technology is, but if there is a next technology that comes out tomorrow, we will expect the industry to use that instead of encryption, because that's, that would be better. So, I do think that the rule, as I said, is meant to evolve with the industry. And that said, I am always excited to hear how we can not only make the rule better, or perhaps address issues and guidance as well.
Who wants to jump in first?
Sure, I'll go, Matt. So I really, like Ileana, and I'm not from the government, I really appreciate HIPAA. HIPAA has been very good to myself and my family and the companies that I've worked for. Again, going back to how the original rule was crafted back in the 90s, it was really just a blueprint of how do you do good security at a company, and then come up with the different safeguards to do that. So I appreciate HIPAA's flexibility. However, and this is nothing against OCR, I do think HIPAA do see HIPAA as the foundation or the floor of a really good security program. And that goes back to the regulations. If HIPAA were to try and get more of the threat intelligence piece, perhaps legislate two-factor authentication, things that are really coming out and really showing a great risk reduction, I think it may take some more time through the NPRM process and getting it legislated, and then the risk is going to change. Security is a fast-moving industry, and I don't think we should be dependent upon the regulators to tell us what we need to do. And in addition to that, I believe there's plenty of other standards that are out there, the NIST ones I spoke of before in the 800 series, that tell and provide great free advice on how to build an effective and mature security program. Healthcare is going to continue to be attacked. I mean, the Ponymon study from last year was noting that only 40% of covered entities and 35% of business associates are even concerned about cyber attacks. So getting them more informed, more insured is very helpful. And let's not forget the other studies that have come out that have said that the healthcare record is, 40 times more valuable than a simple credit card number. So, we're a little bit under-resourced, we're at times a little bit under-resourced, and we're becoming more a prevalent attack. There's a lot of information out there to help us get our shops in order, take advantage of that, but I don't think we need to have necessarily more legislation. There's already a great rule, the HIPAA rule out there to help us with this.
So I guess Ileana, I've been kind of an outspoken critic of the HIPAA security rule of late, and partly it's because of the last 15 years of experience doing assessments at hospitals across the country and seeing how it has been used and misused all too often as a basis for a security program. The HIPAA security rule was never designed, as you know, to be the end-all be-all for how you should build a security program. But unfortunately, we have folks who take a compliance approach to things as opposed to taking a security approach to things, and they think if they do what the HIPAA rule says, and in some cases very literally, they're going to come up very short from where they need to be in terms of actually protecting the environment and protecting the data. And I think that's one of the issues that I have with it, in that it doesn't, even if it's not going to provide more of a prescriptive set of requirements or guidances with respect to security issues, albeit that it's, if you look at any other security framework or rule that is out there today, whether it's NIST or ISO or whatever, you know that those have gone through at least 3 or 4 revisions since the 90s to accommodate the new things that have come up in technology and in the security environment, and there's been no change to the HIPAA security rules since the day it was published. I think if it did anything other, as simply as point to something that says this is the starting point, as Mark suggested. This is not what you base your program on totally. That you have to actually apply this as a set of guideline rules, and then go figure out how best to do it in your environment, based on the technology you have and the processes you have and operations that you have. I think I'd be much more comfortable with it. But unfortunately, we don't have that, and we don't have a clear understanding of where it begins and ends. And we have a lot of organizations out there that have a very much a compliance-based approach to things, and that's not cutting it from a security perspective in today's environment. It's not going to protect them. It's not going to protect their business. It's not going to protect their patient information.
Lee, how about your thoughts?
So, there are very good points that have been made, and I guess I look at the security rule, having been involved with seeing it evolve over since the 90s, and I agree with both Mac and Mark that it is a guide, but I think, and as they also indicated, there's a lot of great other documents out there, NIST and others. I mean, all the various organizations that have, for example, ONC promoted the use of the direct standard. We talked about encryption and authentication. That particular protocol that has been developed and is now being implemented very widely, not only in health plans and in the healthcare industry, but also by the federal agencies such as the VA, Indian Health, and Direct Trust, has been kind of promulgating that with the use of their trust anchor bundle. It goes back to, Mark, your point on the two-factor authentication. So there's a lot of good, what I would call standards, as well as guidance that are out there that really are in addition to the guideline that I think the security rule is. So I am of the opinion that we need to adopt those best practices. We need to adopt those standards. I don't, as Mac was talking about, there hasn't been much in the way of change. Certainly the omnibus rule in 2013 helped to put some further definition around certain aspects, including BAs, as far as HIPAA. But I think there's a lot of good other documents and standards that organizations need to take into account to develop and continue to refine their security infrastructure, because it is really a guide. Organization should not use it to strictly base their entire security platform on.
And I think that's a great point that everyone has made, all four of you, that there is flexibility in the security rule, and that something that I always remind my clients of, and certainly echoed in all of your comments, is the security rule is a floor. It's only, I think, as Mark said, a foundation, and it's really you need to build up a lot higher than just staying on that ground level, or you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So I'm going to actually turn it back over to Carol at this moment to see if we have any pending questions from our audience. So I will let Carol let us know if there are any there. If not, I know we have plenty of other questions that we could discuss.
Well, no surprise. We've got a chat feed full of questions, and we will not get to all of them, but I am capturing these questions, and we'll get them out to our panel and our moderator post-event. So I'm just going to actually dive right in, and this question's for the group. Not talking about the frontline people here, but can you speak to the importance of hammering home more training at the C-level awareness so that organizations really understand how critical this is?
Hey, Matt, this is Ileana. I'm going to just jump right in real quick, just from the regulator's perspective on involving the C-suite. And I don't know if all of the panel's experience is the same, but the organizations that we see that are really successful at sophisticated compliance, and that is HIPAA security rule, and all of the other issues that we've just been talking about, is really understanding the security within their organization, are those where there is security in the C-suite. So, it's really more about having personnel at the level of leadership who understand IT and can communicate those concerns to the rest of the C-suite.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll throw in before letting the rest of the panel weigh in is just generally in the healthcare industry, the Office of the Inspector General for HHS is increasingly making it known that C-level and even the board need to be responsible for issues like this within the organization, and that people at that level can and will be held liable or responsible for issues that could arise.
Matt, I think in addition to what you were talking about OIG and what Ileana was talking about, what we're seeing as well, I think, is you start to see a lot of the attorney generals at the state level as well taking a lot more aggressive action as well regarding any breaches, incidents, etc., and investigations. So we're seeing, I would tell you that with all the breaches, the incidents, the cyber attacks that are occurring in healthcare, we're seeing a lot more awareness on the part of the C-suite, where boards are now getting ongoing reports from the CISO level, from the audit committees, as well are requiring ongoing reports on what is happening within the organization as far as attacks, issues, remediation, And we're also seeing, I think, a lot more dollars that are actually being spent on security and privacy with the CISO as well as the CPO within organizations. There's a lot more education that needs to take place, certainly at the C-suite level, but it is starting to occur because I think at that C-suite, they're starting to recognize, as they're seeing all these organizations that are having breaches and cyber attacks, the impacts on those organizations from a credibility, from stakeholder trust, and they want, and the costs just to mitigate. And so I think there's a lot more visibility and a lot more awareness than ever was, but we got to continue to make that C-suite understand.
Yeah, from my perspective, I have the benefit of working in Philadelphia, which has a very large group of incredibly talented colleagues, fellow CISOs of mine. And a secret to success, I mean, I'll keep it to 3 points. I think most of us have an open door policy. We're not there to scold people because we realize that half of the battles we wage is simply either user negligence or they just don't know. So keeping an open door and allowing your workforce to ask questions of you and how they can improve, I think, is essential. I think also as part of that, becoming the department of no, K-N-O-W versus N-O, is very, very helpful. People are going to circumvent you and cause a greater risk if they don't think you're going to listen or want to be there to enable the business. And any CISO, a security official in the executive suite, that is going to be one of their main drivers, is to enable the business in a secure fashion. Of course, what goes alongside that is certainly having top-down support. So having a CEO and a leadership team that believes in you and gives you the time and the resources is a big deal. Last year's HIM study, the biggest security barrier, the top two were a lack of financial resources at 60% and a lack of appropriate personnel at 64%. So it's one thing to have the support and utilize those three strategies I just spoke of. It's a whole nother thing to find the individual, because there is a war on talent that's going on right now too. So certainly enabling the colleges and trying to get streams of qualified people into your organization. And we, as a security professional, need to do a better job of prepping more people to be leaders, because there is quite a shortage.
So I'd have to agree with all of that, and from my experience, both being on the end that Mark's on, and now on the end of working with hospitals across the country and the folks in his position, I think there's a couple of things here, and that is that I would agree that those organizations that we work with, where the board is engaged, where the senior executive team is aware, where there are good, strong oversight and governance structures that allow privacy and security information to make their way up as they should to the decision makers, tend to do a much better job in terms of their security programs. They get much better support and they get much better funding and overall, I think, performance. What's interesting, I think, is that in addition to that, it's really an issue of visibility. And in those organizations where the CISO has visibility, has the ability to communicate, has the ability to get the message out across the organization, they tend to do better. And it's really just that simple. There's a couple of initiatives that have happened in the last couple of years that I've been very happy to participate in, because I think it's such an important issue. And one of those is Chime, which is all of our CIOs out there in the industry recognize that this is a problem and a challenge, and that directly impacts their ability to deliver quality services to these hospitals. You know, started the AHIS membership, which is for the CISOs out there, or the people that are in these security positions, to hopefully give them a community just like the CIOs have in the Chime organization. And hopefully we're going to see things come out of that begins to elevate that presence and begins to elevate that dialogue, if you will. I know HIMSS Analytics is just finishing up a study that they've or survey that they've run that actually gets right to the heart of where the CISO ought to sit in a healthcare organization, whether they should continue to report to the CIO, or whether they need to, like in other industries, report higher up in the organization and get that message out there more publicly. It'll be interesting to see the results of that. And obviously, I haven't seen the survey. I was just one of the folks who was interviewed after they finished it. But I think that's something we all should keep an eye out for, because this conversation is beginning to be had. And I can tell you that in the last 12 months, I've spent more time than ever talking to boards at organizations than ever before. And they're asking tough questions. They're asking the question: do we have the right guy in the CIO position? Does he get it? Does he understand security? They're asking the question: do we have the right person in the CISO position? Do they get it? Do they have the qualifications to advise this organization the way we need to be advised? And they're asking: are we spending enough? Are we doing the right things? Are we focused in the right areas? And what are our peers doing? So there is more of that conversation going on, and I think that's very healthy, and I think it's something that hopefully will continue and just get better, because let's face it, when something becomes a value for the organization that is communicated from the top down, it gets a lot more support and it gets a lot more attention.
Yeah, just switching to all great points. It was a great question from one of our attendees. Sort of going the other direction, is there any effective way for literally hundreds of thousands of healthcare providers and business associates to do an effective risk analysis? They are the most vulnerable and least prepared, and that's probably a lot of truth in that statement.
Actually, I think Carol, I guess they cannot. As we were talking about earlier, there are some great tools that are out there that are fairly inexpensive, that organizations can go through on an ongoing basis for smaller providers, smaller entities in healthcare. They can go through. There's some great tools that are free out there, as well as training. So the point is, yes, organizations can do that. Smaller organizations can, and they can do it fairly inexpensively. They can do it themselves. I know other organizations, some providers will have a third party come in to help with some of the training and provide a recommendation on the type of tool set or tool suite that they can use. But there are some very, very good tools that are out there that will take them through everything from A to Z. I know that many of the provider organizations as well, like the American Dental Association, the AMA, AHA, and others, MGMA, provide a variety of tool sets to their members as well to go through that fairly inexpensively. So again, I think that what organizations, providers, and other smaller entities need to be aware of is leverage the tools that are out there, because there are some really good ones.
I know NIST has one, and NIST, you can go to NIST and Google it, and HIMSS has a tool as well, I believe. In balancing budgets, how do you see the utilization of third-party vendors in offsetting the lack of talent within the organization?
I can take that one. So that's in a very effective way. Obviously, if the number one security barrier is the lack of personnel, you have to look at what's called MSSP, or Managed Security Service Providers. These are talented folks that can come in and kind of serve as a long arm or an extension of your staff doing things. And they're typically used for more technical areas, in my opinion. So at our company and other places we've been, we've used them for security information and event management and monitoring to form that security operations center, or SOC, to outsource a certain part of that. Some other things that can take more time but don't require a high technical skill set and require more a vendor skill set, such as patch management, can be used. Any of those things can be very helpful to outsource to managed service providers. And often they can do so at a more effective and a cheaper rate than you could get inside your company. The other thing, too, that when you're looking at external parties to help you, and it kind of fits in nicely with one of the previous questions, about how to make an effective security program. I think we all danced around, that collaboration is key, and getting, knowing how to converse with the executive suite. And part of that is to not overlook your own internal audit. Most covered entities have an internal audit branch, and having those folks come in and do a key assessment can certainly help get funding, and as well as have another opinion to help justify a certain technology investment. Those can be very helpful.
We are just about out of time. Just a couple of quick notes. A couple of people wanted to know the name of the study, Mark, that you referenced to. It was the Ponemon Institute, Ponemon, I believe, the Ponemon Institute. They do an annual study regarding breaches and security. And then, Mac, the organization you mentioned, it's the National Health ISAC. Is that ISAC?
ISAC.
Okay, ISAC. Okay, great. And then, Ileana, you'd mentioned some videos?
Yeah, Carol, from the OCR website, our newly redesigned website is much more user-friendly. You want to go to the security rule, and we link to 2 different risk analysis tools there. One that we did in conjunction with NIST. It is more of a complicated tool, but it is downloadable. We do not track any of these downloads. We don't collect any information on the users, so just FYI. And then there is a link to the tool that we developed with the Office of the National Coordinator. So it's on both our website and ONC's website. And it's a small provider risk analysis tool. And that also has an accompanying video that walks users through how to do a risk analysis, sort of a more basic version of a risk analysis if you're a smaller provider. But that is from the hhs.gov/HIPAA/or/privacy. You can also just Google HIPAA, and OCR's website is the first one that comes up.
Great. All great information. We are out of time. I want to thank all of you for participating today. It was a great event. And to our attendees, we'll make sure we get a recording on the YouTube video out to you within the next 24 hours.